Hello, and welcome to today's event, How to Automate and Secure Student Lifecycle. This is Stephen Zink. I'm the Senior Fellow for the Center for Digital Education and Emeritus University of Nevada Vice President for Information Technology and Vice Chancellor of the Nevada System of Higher Education. I'm excited to serve as a moderator for today's event and want to say thank you for joining us. I know we're in for an informative session over the next 60 minutes on this very important issue. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. A recording of this presentation will be emailed to all registrants within 48 hours. You can use the recording for your reference or feel free to pass it along to colleagues. The webcast is designed to be interactive, and you can participate in the Q&A with us by asking questions at any time during the presentation. And I do really encourage you to submit those questions up front, because this is a topic that always brings up many different questions, and the importance of it and the criticality of it just cannot be overstated in today's environment. You should see a Q&A box in the bottom left of the presentation panel. Please send your questions as they come up through the presentation. Any question is acceptable. Our speakers will address as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A portion at the close of our webinar today. If you'd like to download a PDF of the slides for this presentation, you can do so by clicking the Webinar Resources widget at the bottom of the console. Also, during today's webinar, you'll be able to connect with your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Please use hashtag CDE Live to connect with your peers across the Center for Digital Education platform via Twitter. At the close of the webinar, we encourage you to complete a brief survey about the presentation. We'd like to hear what you think. If you're unable to stay with us for the entire webinar but would like to complete the survey, please click the survey widget at the bottom of the screen to launch the survey. Otherwise, it will pop up once the seminar concludes. At this time, please disable any pop-up blockers you might have, and if you're experiencing any media player issues or have other problems, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the help button at the bottom of the console. Again, if you're experiencing any difficulties with such as audio issues, simply hit that yellow button at the bottom of the console. Now, I'm really pleased today to say that joining me is Jim Jorstad and Jim Fout. And I would like to first introduce Jim Jorstad, who may be familiar to many of you. He's been a leading force in the innovative and effective use of technology in teaching, learning, and research for many years. Currently, he's the Director of ITS Client Services at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. His involvement is widespread in many IT and technology areas. Beyond the campus, Jim is a noted lecturer, consultant, and technologist for universities, organizations, and corporations worldwide. Jim has been selected as one of the top 30 technology transformers in the United States and was the recipient of the 2013 CNN iReport Spirit Award. His work has nearly 1 million views worldwide. He is active in EDUCAUSE and has served that organization in numerous ways over the years. Jim Fout has been building integrations for customers for 25 years. Jim joined Okta, the sponsor of our broadcast today, in 2017 as a cloud enterprise architect who redesigned solutions that meet demanding customer requirements. He got his start developing building solutions that meet demanding customer requirements. And that was in the pre.com era. Since then, he's been helping organizations integrate and deploy solutions encompassing identity management, portals, and e-commerce. He spent 10 years with Sun Microsystems and Oracle prior to joining Okta. His experience includes a variety of verticals, including education, government, banking, pharmacy, and telecommunications. He lives in Colorado, where he enjoys spending time with his family, photography, and probably not today, playing golf. So, as we move forward, I would just like to introduce the subject and what I would call this whole topic area as a lesson in complexity. Few IT projects today have the importance as well as the breadth and depth of the impact of the implementation of modern identity and access management systems on a university campus. Yet it is likely one of IT's least appreciated tasks. It makes ERP projects look sexy. No one owns IAM as do stakeholders for a new HR system or a financial or student system. Access and authentication is just assumed across the system. IT is somehow going to provide this magically. The problem seems simple enough. Just give someone a login and let them choose a password. What could possibly go wrong? Well, we found out what's gone wrong. In the earliest days of higher education IT and IT in general, each application provided its own approach to permit access and to assign privileges within that application. The scalability of this solution proved pretty limited, and directories and other means of consolidating cross-application management emerged as a critical service, not only for security, but also user acceptance and just general usability. Even though such efforts were ostensibly automated with such tools as Active Directory, the time it took to maintain and adapt the rapid proliferation of software applications with a constantly changing student user base in particular quickly outstripped most institutions' abilities to keep up with all the demands, and subsequently many applications that demand for those centralized access just fell by the wayside. The number of, as well as the complexity of applications and the desire to have increasingly granular control of processes within single software applications combined with heightened concerns regarding security and privacy reached critical mass a few years ago. Then, combined with that, you had cloud acceptance in the cloud for many what were locally based solutions, and this put the control that had been at the campus even further afield. In response to this growing complexity, a new breed of third-party services began to emerge a few years ago. And that is our discussion for today. I would maintain that this is probably one of the most essential applications that IT has to accommodate in the next few years, not only for user acceptance, but for security and privacy concerns. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Jim Jorstad to make a brief presentation about his perspective on the problem.
Great. Thank you, Steve. You really set this up very well for us. I'm going to talk kind of broadly on the idea of IAM, or Identity Access Management. And the categories really are challenges, tools, and resolutions. And on the screen that you see right now are some key things I'm going to cover fairly quickly, and we'll come back to these reoccurring themes as we go through the presentation. So we'll talk a little bit about what IAM stands for and talk about the continuum of how it affects our students as we automate and secure the student lifecycle. We all are quite familiar with cybersecurity. It's one of the number one things that we deal with on a daily basis. Password management, how we can make it easier or much easier for our end user to manage their passwords on their own after business hours or across the world. There are some IT challenges we kind of forget about, because for those in the audience who are IT practitioners, you'll identify with we have some challenges to maintain our being current with the topic of IAM. And then our goal, of course, is going to ensure our student success. And IAM really works in an environment that's mobile, and that's kind of what we're dealing with in our today's environment. So, very quickly, when I see the word IAM in the older years, Steve was talking about IT of old. In the old world, IAM could have been IAM IT. And we have to get away from that acronym that really this is a collaboration of many different areas. So when we talk about identity and access management, we're talking about the policies we have, the process we have in place at our IT enterprise, and we use these technologies to really decide who our users are. Are they, in fact, the people they say they are? And then we want to make these rules enforceable as far as how we have grant access to all the digital resources we have on our campuses. And they could be, of course, email or learning management system. They could be specific applications and, of course, of databases. And there's other things that we can add to these resources. It's important to remember as a campus. Some campuses may not decide to do IAM for all things at the same time. You may be a campus that says, well, let's start with our learning management system first, and then later on transition to email and so on and so forth. The key here is that we need to communicate very clearly to our administration and our end users. What's our plan from point A to point B? Are we going to go to all of our applications in email and LMS, or are we going to do kind of a segmented approach? In this case, timing is everything. So this is a good descriptor of IAM if you're trying to explain it to someone who doesn't really understand the concept. So let's talk to this very quickly. What you're really trying to do is provide the right individuals access to the correct resources you have at any time. And what I mean by any time, that's 24/7 and for the appropriate reasons. This is probably the best distilled definition of what identity management is all about. And this is our overarching goal as we move forward. So let's talk about some of the challenges that are real in the world of IT and throughout the enterprise. One is, how do you provision these accounts? And for example, we have new students coming to our campuses, our technical colleges, our universities. That's pretty simple. They start after graduation from high school, or they're transfer students, and we provision their account. We have our current students, and this gets a little bit more complicated. Are they returning students, where did they do their undergraduate at your institution? They came back 5 years later and want to do their graduate work. How do you provision these accounts? And mind you, and there's a long span of, let's say a student came in 2012 and comes back in 2018, 2019, you might have changed your internal processes. You may have had an application that you had a specific net ID that was a certain way of formatting, and then you made a change internally. Now you format it differently. How do you reconcile those two eras of your IT infrastructure? Then we have returning students who might return as staff. Maybe you graduate from the same institution you come back to and are hired for a position. What does their original provision account look like as student, and what's your protocols to when they become an employee or staff? And then lastly, this is a newer one, you may have staff who return as students. And then how is your provisioning process for that? So it's very important to look at this carefully. And, for example, I asked this question to a recent university, and I said, what are your provisioning processes? And I got 4 or 5 different answers within IT. So it's important to have this understandable not only to your external audience, but your internal audience should know the very clear-cut process that you have in place. So this is where we talk about this IAM continuum. It's quite natural in high school we start the process. Some universities might start the process before they even come to a campus and track them and maybe have a guest account to understand the university resources they'll be coming to. And then they graduate from high school, they come to college, they're freshmen, they have their tenure of 4 to 5, maybe 6 years, they graduate, and at that point, do they come back to your institution? Do you track them? What happens to their account once they leave the enterprise? This is all the important processes that we have to manage in the world of the IAM continuum. So some challenges that we have. The goal here, we want to make it easy for the end user. So single sign-on is certainly what we want to achieve. You want to have that one identity that's directed just to you. Centralized password management is very, very important. For example, it's somewhat more easy on campus. If you want to change a password, you come to the help desk, you call the help desk, you write a help desk ticket. But what if those individuals are in a different city, a different state, different country? Consider online students. And also consider a situation where it's after hours. It's one thing to be open until 4:30 in the afternoon, but what happens if it's on a weekend? What happens if it's holidays? And that's where the self-directed password reset is important when you want to maintain the processes in an IAM environment. Self-service is critically important to be successful. Now, there are some challenges within IT, and I think this is important for each of you to take a look at, and I'll get to that slide in just a moment. For example, in IT challenges, what about your staffing? And in this case, when we talk about staffing, can you keep the people you already have? Can you afford the people you actually have? And why don't we train these individuals? How can you make it that they stay there? How do you retain them? How do you train your employees? These are all critically important as you move forward. Also, in the IM system, when you pick a system like this, you have to ensure that it's stable. Is it scalable? Is it secure? So as much as we talk about picking the product that's best for our enterprise, it's also important to look at, do you have the staff that you can keep your staff that understand these processes? Do you train your staff to understand how to use the IM systems that you've incorporated? So it's a full-time situation that you need to be aware of. Now, what about cybersecurity? In this case, when we talk about cybersecurity, this is a driving factor as far as how you use IM. We want to make sure that people who are actually logging in are the people they say they are. And this is the critical nature of how to make sure you have a good system that you've chosen, you have a great product, and you have a great partner in that product. Let's move ahead as far as what about student success? And real briefly, this is a study that was done actually last year, and there's 3 groups that did this study. There's a number of acronyms here, so I apologize for that. There's NASPA, which is the Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Ed, AIR, the Association for Institutional Research, and ADUCAUSE. And what was interesting about this study, they asked these groups of what their involvement is. So let's just look at this very quickly. In this study, 60% of the professionals reported that they had some involvement in assessing the impact of student interventions. Almost the same amount of the student affairs professionals reported that they were involved in developing an institutional-wide data strategy, and that might be something that typically IR, or institutional research, leads. And then we have IT professionals, and they said basically that they reported that their involvement was in managing early alert system. Well, in some regard, this is primarily the role of student affairs in the institutional research. So are these nearly 1,000 respondents? What does this tell us? It means that we all have to talk together about what our roles are. And when we talk about IT, it isn't just IT in an AIM environment. It's who is your institutional researchers, who is the student affairs professionals, and who are your IT professionals. They all have to work together. And at that right-hand part of the slide, it says, never stop learning. That is not just for students. That is also for our IT staff as well. The other critical thing about IM, or identity management, is basically students want to be mobile. And I had experienced one university, there's a real-life situation where in the fall semester, they had approximately 1,000 accounts that were compromised because it was a phishing attack, and students had clicked on the link. And what Microsoft would do is suspend those accounts, and it takes an IT group or a help desk to bring those accounts back, which takes a fair amount of time. And when asking the students why they had clicked on the phishing attack, the number one reason was they were checking their email on their phone. And when you do that, you can't really hover over the link to see if it's a valid link or not. And that's a good indication of that we need to be aware of our end user, our students, make sure they're successful. What are the tools they're using? They want to be mobile. And are we sure we have an IM system in place that ensures that they have access to the tools they need to be successful, as well as the tools that our professional staff and faculty need to be successful. So that's a quick primer on my perspective at IM. I'd like to turn it over to Jim Fout for Okta to talk about his perspective on how to automate and secure the student life cycle.
Yeah, thank you very much. Glad to be on the call today. I'm Jim Fout, a Cloud Enterprise Architect with Okta. Let's take a look at Okta's ability to solve these common problems with which many organizations struggle. The digital needs of students, let me advance the slide, sorry here. There we go. The digital needs of students, faculty, staff, and alumni are growing at a rapid pace, and schools need to be keeping up with the demand. They need to provide services that are secure for the school and the user, and do it in a way that lowers IT friction and is convenient for the users. Automating lifecycle management is key. Users need access to a variety of cloud-based services, each of which requires some identifying information. Automatically managing these cloud accounts based on roles is key to making sure that the users have access to the services they need quickly and disabling access to services they don't. This really reduces the chance for human error, eliminates orphan accounts, and therefore greatly reduces the attack surface of the institution. And schools have particularly challenging identity needs. They have regular surges of accounts being created and access requirements changing at the beginning and end of each term. These surges create issues when it comes to planning scalability for on-premise systems. Cloud identity solutions can accommodate these scaling requirements with ease. In the cloud, scalability is part of the platform, and the cost of additional resources during times of high activity is really not a factor. Identity management technology has been around for quite some time. I've been around working with solutions going back to the early 2000s. So many schools have some sort of solution in place today. Most of these systems, though, are on-premise and aging technologies, whether they were homegrown, open source, or potentially other legacy commercial solutions. The expertise required to maintain these systems is putting a burden on the IT staff that really needs to be directed elsewhere. It's getting more and more difficult to find the expertise to maintain those systems, and ongoing business continuity is becoming a serious concern. Many of these systems were built with the connectors that target on-premise solutions, and they haven't kept up with the cloud software market. Each new cloud service that the school adopts requires more custom connector development on the legacy platform. And a modern cloud identity system that is focused on cloud integration is something that schools are asking for. Okta believes that Lifecycle is most easily managed if it's delivered via a policy-based approach. This means easy configurations that make sense to IT admins instead of custom-coded business processes that only make sense to developers or consultants. So at each stage of a user's lifecycle, whether it's sourcing an identity, assigning resources, or offboarding a user, you can achieve what you need to do with a few clicks of the mouse. Modern lifecycle management solutions utilize standards like SCIM, SAML, and OpenID Connect to connect to cloud services. These standards are being adopted quickly, making it important to have a platform in place that makes it easy to integrate with those standards. But it's not just about those standards. There are still a number of large service providers that have their own APIs and specific requirements. Lifecycle management solutions need to have built-in connectors for HR and student information systems, on-premise directories, cloud productivity suites, CRM, and file sharing services, just to name a few. Each of these have their own needs, such as account provisioning and deprovisioning, license management, entitlements, and attribute synchronization. Schools need to be able to exercise choice in selecting these key vendors and know that their identity management solution will ease the integration and not be something that adds cost and gets in the way of adoption. Okta is a modern identity platform designed to automate lifecycles for all users, and there are multiple benefits of this solution. First, ensuring that new employees and students are productive and happy on day one. Additionally, automation reduces errors and therefore the inevitable tension between HR and IT. Reduce errors by removing manual approaches, thereby enhancing security. Incorrect access is no longer granted, and accounts are offboarded in a timely fashion according to policies that meet your organization's requirements for strong security posture. And finally, have one solution to handle all your user types. So now I want to talk a little bit about Okta and integration with the InCommon Federation and EduRoam services. InCommon is the U.S.-based federation that is part of the larger global federation known as EduGain. Many schools have deployed Shibboleth as their IDP in order to comply with the requirements of this federation. Okta recently became an InCommon partner, and we understand the requirements of hosting a service like this in the environment. Okta can integrate with the Shibboleth deployment, expanding the capabilities of the school's identity solution. Use Shibboleth as a SAML bridge to the InCommon Federation while leveraging the additional capabilities of Okta to provide a more robust solution. Okta brings several new features such as lifecycle management, our multi-factor authentication, the Okta integration network with over 6,000 existing applications and connections, self-service password reset capabilities, a simple Active Directory integration, OIDC support for mobile and modern application development, high availability and scalability, and finally a nice intuitive GUI administration interface. There are a number of schools running this configuration in production today, and we are happy to demonstrate this integration and discuss the technical details of the configuration. EduRoam is a global Wi-Fi network available to the education community. It relies on a network of radio servers that authenticate users based on their campus credentials. Okta can enable EduRoam authentication using its LDAP interface. This allows schools to eliminate the need for a highly available and redundant on-premise LDAP service that must be maintained, shift the authentication task to Okta, and reduce the on-premise requirement. Thank you very much, and I'll pass it back to you.
This is Steve Zink again, and I'd like to ask our panel some questions. One of the things that always concerns IT administrators and others in major functional areas isn't adopting a commercial IAM solution a major high-risk implementation? And let's ask Jim, who's representing a campus here, Jim Jorstad, his perspectives on this.
Sure, Steve. Thank you. Well, the way I would look at it is that the risk of implementation is really outweighed by if you not conduct an implementation in the first place, because I think it's essential. To this end, I think institutions need to find a vendor who is really a true partner, and that will ensure a successful implementation. You don't want to get a situation where you feel the vendor is just selling you a product, and then once you've made the procurement, the support dwindles. And so you really have to find a partner in arms that helps you through this process. The other thing I think is important, Steve, is that you really need to prepare a well-thought-out project scope and avoid that dreaded project creep we all have seen in the world of IT. And how you try to eliminate that project creep is, what's your timeline look like? What's your training plan? And the communications plans. And I do come from a communications background, that you really have to be very clear-cut of how you communicate with your end users, your administrators, and the entire enterprise, basically, and keep them as your partners as well. It needs to be a campus initiative, and it has to appear to be a campus initiative. That's critical when you get your president, your chancellor, your provost, and your assistant vice chancellors involved, because it really can't be viewed as an IT-only initiative. Typically, when you see those types of projects, it's the doom and gloom of, well, IT is making us do this. It's got to be a team approach, and it's important to implement your IAM solution with a realistic timeline. I'll get back to where, don't say you can do this in 2 months, when really a good implementation is going to take you 6 months. Have your timeline out there and clearly communicate to the campus, this is how much time it's going to take, the administration on board, this is what the role of the end user is, and at the end of the day, this is the goal it's going to accomplish to make our campus safer and our student success much more successful.
Thanks, Jim. And I'd like to ask Jim Fout about this. Particularly, I think one of the things that Jim Jorstad was talking about is that implementing this type of solution it's almost like putting in networking. It's a little below the surface, and it's certainly hard to explain. What would you say about that, Jim?
Yeah, it's definitely a big project to undertake. I think that it's a very important decision for any organization, and it really shouldn't be underestimated. But really adopting a solution is quite a bit less risky than the alternative of not adopting one, like Jim mentioned. Really, when you're out there selecting an IAM solution from a vendor, try to look for one that places a high value on customer success, one that's a leader in the industry and has an established product, and also has a large partner ecosystem that can mitigate many of those risks. So really it's about working with that vendor as a partner, not just during the implementation phase, but also post-implementation as you grow and expand the system and find new opportunities to drive efficiencies within your organization.
Yeah, it seemed to me that identity access and management it's always made my head swim. It's like three-dimensional chess on Star Trek. And I always admired the folks that tried to understand it and pulled off implementation. How difficult, Jim Jorstad, from your perspective, is it to move from a commercial IAM solution, particularly if you had been doing like most of us have done, um, using a homegrown or Active Directory or something like that? And
Well,
how
I think
long does that take?
Yeah, it kind of varies. It really depends on your institution. I've kind of said this a little bit earlier, but it still has relevancy here. You really have to look at your project scope. You asked about the time. I think that really is determined by what's your motivation to do an IM? Is it that you're getting some initiative through an audit that says you need to get this done by a certain time? And this is kind of a caveat to campuses. Sometimes when you're in a system, and I know, Steve, you worked in a system, these mandates come down, but sometimes the people making the decisions don't have an appreciation for what it takes to, as we say, the IT on the ground or the end users on the ground. How do you make it happen? And that's where it's important for campuses to be able to talk about what's realistic, because when you deploy things like this, it isn't the only project you're working on. So when someone says we want to do something in 3 months, what does that mean? What time of the year? Are you going to deploy this when faculty and staff are on campus or students are not on campus? It's a timing issue. So that's where it's important that IT has to reach out to these end users, but also when you talk about commercial or homegrown, it's really important to find advocates, and on your campus and off your campus. And what I really encourage people to do is it shouldn't be that IT is talking about the deployment like each of us have worked on. You've got to get the provost and your president and chancellor involved and pick some faculty who have the voices to say, yep, this is important. This is going to make the student success better. It's going to keep our campus safer, and we can still get access to our resources. And if we have problems and your shop is closed for the day, we have created a mechanism to be able to reset passwords and regain your identity. So sometimes I think the commercial solution is going to be typically more robust because they've seen this at many institutions. When you rely on a homegrown system, you only know what you know on your campus sometimes. And I think that's where the commercial integration could be a very successful option for you.
Yeah, let's Jim Fout. Can you can probably lend a little more light on that. I think one of the things that is going to push higher education and has already is the widely available commercial application from popular websites with resetting passwords and making that so straightforward and simple.
Yeah, I mean, really, when you start looking at doing an IDM deployment, there's a couple of aspects. Obviously, you've got the technical aspect of the solution that you select, but there's also that sort of social aspect or agreement amongst stakeholders that's extremely important, like Jim was mentioning. So the initial challenge quite often is getting all the stakeholders together, try to ascertain what your current processes are, try to figure out how those processes will work with a commercial vendor solution, and then come up with agreement on how the new function is going to work in the new solution. So trying to drive that consensus can quite often be a challenge in and of itself, but you certainly don't want to compound that with difficulties with the implementation product at every turn. So the quicker and easier you can adjust, readjust, and put in changes and implement new technologies and services as you go along through the process, the better it can be. So one of the initial steps you really need to look at early on is, what is your authoritative source for identity data? This could be an HR system, or it could be a student information system, depending on the identities, or it could also be sourced from an existing Active Directory or LDAP or something like that that's on campus. But having that authoritative source where all identities come from is important to drive automation and consistency in the identity management system. And then once you figure all of that out, you can start figuring on defining your group memberships and associated policies to really drive application access and entitlements for the resources that people need access to.
Yeah, I would assume that probably getting that one directory, one definitive authoritative directory may pose a challenge for universities that are by its very nature a little decentralized. I'm sure that's one common problem. Jim, Jorstad, can you speak to that and perhaps others?
Right. One of the problems I would identify is knowing, I think, who's the keeper of the data. I've been in situations where roles are not defined. So if we talk about, like, for example, provision and accounts, IT looks at, well, we're the technology providers. We can make it work. And then you might get a request, well, there's a problem with a specific employer student. And some people say, well, that's an HR problem. They actually fill out the form to make the process work. And so what you find yourself is, okay, who is really the keeper of the data? Who makes the decisions? And I've seen situations where both want the same result, student success. But when HR is pointing to IT and IT is pointing to HR, and the help desk is in between, it's not a good formula for success. So I think you've got to look at the whole deployment. Look at the other common problem is that you're going to have people who are late adopters. In other words, they don't want to change. They've done it this way since they ever came to your campus, and so you really need to help shepherd them along, and maybe use other advocates to say, this is why we're doing this migration. This is important. Obviously, good planning is a natural, but also I think it's good to trim down unrealistic expectations. Sometimes we can be in a situation where we oversell our initiative, but make sure we do what we have to do and what we set out to do, but don't emphasize expectations you cannot meet or timelines you cannot meet. And then again, get back to why are we doing this initiative in the first place? And that's probably a big challenge when you have people who are resistant to change. And I have a great quote I'll tell you. For those who remember Monk, the TV program, he has a great line about change. And he says, change doesn't scare me. I just don't want to be around when it happens. And we do have individuals that feel that way, and we need to find ways to engage them and say, we are your partner. We'll work you through. This is why we're headed down this path.
Oh, I think those are very good points, and you don't have to worry, I think, so much about IT, unless when they're trying to get funding. That's the greatest concern, when they oversell expectations. Expectations seem to generate themselves over time. I'm curious, as we move through different biometrics and everything else, what are factors that can contribute to accommodating multi-factor systems, and perhaps this is subsequently a question for Jim Fout, but also what do you see for accommodating in the future? I mean, everyone's using the smartphone with the fingerprint management and opening up access. Jim Jorstad, what do you see on your campus?
Yeah, that's a great question. We use we get smartphones as probably the number one use, but we have an equally large group that uses both. And then the smallest group, it's about 60, 20 approximately, the breakout of those. What we find is that you have to understand the processes that people, for example, we have a situation where I've seen you have student employees that have to multi-factor in to prove their identity. And our preferred method for a dual-factor authentication is to use a smartphone. Most people always have smartphones. And we ran a situation where one unit might have 50 to 100 students working as employees. And no one really thought about, well, what is their business processes? So when we start digging deep, we realize that a policy that no students can use cell phones at work. So that's the important part of it, is to drill down to say, yes, we can use fobs, we can use cell phones, but unless you drill down, okay, well, how you actually do your job on a daily basis. So I think for the most part, our recommended way is to make sure people use cell phones, There was some resistance because people thought they were going to be charged data, and they would not. It's just almost a small amount of data that's actually transferred. And the other thing we found is that sometimes fobs cannot work, where they're in your pocket and you're clicking them, and it can send them in where they become out of sync. That's a technical thing we realized. So, and some people don't have, believe it or not, touchscreen cell phones or smartphones. They have the flip up. Well, then that doesn't work too well. So it depends on your campus. I guess I would just emphasize, make sure you understand their business practices before you go on the path. And so far, we've been fairly successful.
Well, Jim Fout, what would you say about this?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Jim just said. I think being flexible is key. There's a lot of options out there today in terms of the form factor of multi-factor authentication, everything from hard tokens to SMS text or email, all the way up to smartphone devices that can handle things like fingerprint or Face ID with Windows Hello. All the range of stuff is available. And some of the most convenient ones are the simple push notifications where you just tap a button and say, approve my access. So really what you're looking for is a system that allows for a wide variety of capabilities to suit the different needs, I guess, of your user population. As Jim mentioned, some users are going to have smartphones, some may not. Having a backup capability there to get a voice call or something like that as a backup solution is also good in case they lose their device or have some sort of hardware issue. So being flexible really is key.
Yeah, Jim Fout, this would be a question for you. I know when we were implementing Workday, one of the things I found fascinating for identity management was the relationships that a third-party vendor from the outside could really facilitate, and otherwise higher ed would be redoing the same sort of mechanisms to provide identity access and management for cloud-based systems. I always found it amazing, the relationships that vendors, it was a one-time affair as opposed to every higher education institution trying to deal with it. Maybe you could speak to that advantage.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very important because if you think about an identity management system, I kind of look at it as data input and then data output, right? So you're going to feed this system with authoritative data from some sort of a source, and the closer of a integration that you can have with that authoritative source, the better your system is going to operate right out of the jump, right? So if there's a existing connector from your vendor to bring in data from a HR or SIS system such as Workday and so forth, then that's going to get that data into the system that much more quickly. Having capabilities such as real-time sync and incremental imports, things like that, are things to look for as key features with that integration. And then once data is in the system, obviously you got to get that data out to the other systems that the students are going to, or the other identities and resources are going to access. So that's where connectors for provisioning accounts, deprovisioning accounts, setting entitlements, and activating and deactivating accounts in those target systems is really important, because you don't want to have to go out. You don't want to develop it the first time, and you certainly don't want to have to keep up with the maintenance. As we've seen over the years, these technologies change. Probably every, in my experience, I feel like every 4 or 5 years things change, right? Initially we were doing proprietary API stuff, and then everything went to XML. Now, a lot of this stuff is either using a SCIM interface or a proprietary RESTful interface with JSON payloads. So as these vendors change how they interoperate with different technologies, you really don't want to have to go back to the drawing board and redo these connectors on your own. Having updates come automatically from a vendor that understands that market and those technologies as they shift is extremely helpful.
Yeah, it's a godsend. It really is. One area that if you can't attract attention for the more abstract identity management, which sort of goes over many people's heads, one area that has become very apparent to all sectors of higher education is security and privacy. And there is no question that an IAM application and solution is essential in that. Jim, can you speak to that from the campus perspective?
As far as what the common problems are, I'm trying to think what the exact question you're asking, Steve.
Well, what prompted you to undertake,
sure.
probably in the attack surface, for
Right.
an IAM solution?
Exactly. The great question. For those who are in the audience today, I would say if you ever go through a security audit, that's a good prompt to make sure you address an IAM solution. And that's not to say that isn't something that we were certainly looking at, but that certainly gives you more of an impetus to move forward much quicker. And so what we looked at is, okay, we have an audit. We have to classify your data into low, medium, and high risk. And so that's the other thing is that you have to look at to identify what your data classification is. The other thing is one of the policies that you have, and in our case, this is the University of Wisconsin system, which has quite a number of different institutions, 4-year and 2-year institutions. And in that case, you've got to look at how each campus has a different way of looking at things. How do you want to approach this? The other impetus, I would say, I use the example of phishing attacks or cybersecurity attacks. That's going to prompt you. How do you trim those down? And I will say that I've seen them go down. That 1 year you may have up to 1,000 compromised accounts, students and some faculty, some administration, that inadvertently click on very astute phishing attacks. How do you prevent them? Well, if you have a very robust IAM solution, the goal and the natural outcome is going to be you're going to reduce those. So I think that an audit, again, for those who have gone through it, it can be very rigorous. You need to identify your miscellaneous and shared accounts using multi-factor to make sure people are who they say they are, getting the right resources available. You've got student employees in the mix. You have student employees who are working with in environments such as records and registration. You may have student assistants and, of course, staff members in HR working with sensitive data. You've got individuals in social research, student affairs, healthcare. All these come to bear. And so you've got to look at the whole enterprise about what are the risks, and that was one of the first questions I believe, Steve, you asked, what is the risk of doing an IAM? And I would counter that by saying the risk is greater by not having a definitive plan of how you're going to deploy your IAM and for what purposes and how long it will take with a good timeline. And hopefully that kind of answers your question about what prompted our campus at least.
Yeah, that does. And one of those prompts, probably Jim Fout can speak of, it's increasingly common, is compliance requirements from various agencies, federal, state, and others.
Yeah, absolutely. Like Jim was mentioning, you're going to hit this as soon as you start to take a look at undergoing an audit for sure. A good commercial vendor is going to have capabilities in there to help assist you in meeting those compliance requirements. Things like automating the processes so that they're consistent, resistant to human error, and provide a predictable outcome is really going to help. So you can go into the system and take a look at those policies and show the auditors, look, here's how data comes in, here's how it's processed, and here's the end result. You can also go back and take a look at history by, looking at system logs and reports to show, the actual access that people have in the system. And then long-term data retention can be accomplished by pulling in the SIM system to consume those logs, and then you can go back and take a look at who had access to what at any particular point in time.
Thank you so much, Jim. I just want to encourage anyone, I think we're answering a lot of the questions that you might have in your mind, but if you have any specific questions, be sure to post them so we can address them. Not all applications are created equally, and not all demand the same security. I think, Jim, you may have touched on this already, and if you have, we could just pitch it on to Jim Fout.
Well, I'll just say real quickly that you're quite correct. Data classification, what I would like to add is that who is the person who is doing the data classification. And that's important, is that you have to have trust in the individual saying, well, yes, this would qualify as high risk or moderate risk. And I've seen some situations where some individuals might group moderate and high risk together, but not realizing what the implications of that are. And so then you have low risk data, we don't tend to worry about as much. But I think it's important to have some mechanism to classify your data. But secondarily, it probably shouldn't just be one person making the decision, well, this I feel is high risk, to have like more of a dialogue with either the unit that you're dealing with or your IT staff internally. It's got to be a collaborative discussion and a collaborative agreement. I guess I would add that. It's important to have, just to make sure it's clear cut. Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, and I would think it would have to be part of a larger data management approach.
Yeah, and I think, if you look at identity and access management, it's identity and access management, right? Really, because it's really two things. It's not one thing. Really, the processes and procedures you put in place to set up your identity information in the tool, define those policies to determine who has access to what groups they're a member of, and what applications they have access to. That's all that identity layer. And then the access piece really comes into that sort of real-time evaluation. When they're accessing it, is it the right time? Do they have the right need to access that information? And is their security posture to the level that you want it to be to access those particular elements? So for things that are rated as, a high classification or something like that, moderate risk, high risk, it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to rate it that way if you can't enforce it in a particular way that meets the demand. So having a tool that allows you to do things, for example, check their IP address, in other words, their geolocation, their IP location, whether they're on network, off network, in China, in the U.S., those kinds of things is very important, as well as potentially making decisions based on the device type, right? Is it a trusted device? Is it a Apple versus Android device? Those kinds of decision criteria. Is it mobile versus laptop? Will help you determine and create policies that are flexible and meet the needs of your access requirements based on that classification.
And Jim, I'm going to throw you this softball out there.
Okay.
What do faculty and staff and students want and need in an IAM environment? And I'm going to say that your response is going to be everything.
Everything, of course, and then some, because we want to exceed expectations. It's a great question. I'll try to hit it out of the park if I can, but certainly they want to be flexible. They want a system that's reliable. I think whatever product you choose, it's helpful to have a dashboard to show, as Jim Fouch was talking about, the status of all your end users. And also, they want it anytime, anywhere, and they want access 24/7. I will say the other thing that's important, it's kind of related, when you deploy this IAM system, you want to get people on board. And one of the things I felt very helpful was to kind of show the campus. You would track when people have been provisioned into an IAM system or a dual-factor authentication, that you can show the campus, well, this is our timeline. At halfway into it, 50% of the people have gotten their fobs and smartphones and they've activated their account. And I think that's good, and that you have a dashboard that kind of show people's progress along the way. And then when you get to the end and it's crunch time and D-Day for your multi-factor to come live for your application or for your entire campus, to show 90% of the campus is going to be compliant. But you still have that 10% that you're hopeful that you can get those people on board. And some people will say, I don't see the value. And that's going to happen. The other thing I'm going to add to this, as I look at our time, is I do want to add one point about the self-management. What do they want? They want to be informed of what the plan is before, during, and after. And what we do is we monitor, when we send emails out, we use an email integrator that we kind of look at, well, what is the percentage of people opening up their emails? So we can kind of show that 50 to 60% of the people, let's say staff, open our emails, which is a great percentage. The industry average is 16%. So we're doing great. But still, and this is for Steve and Jim, that means that 30 or 40% are not opening those emails. So the trick for IT perspective is to kind of keep that process going, make sure you give them relevant information, make sure you want to give everybody everything and have satisfaction. And people feel satisfied when you attend their needs, you're listening to them, but you're also communicating to them 24/7. That's what it comes down to, I think, Steve.
Okay, thanks so much, Jim. What is the divide between workforce IAM and consumer IAM? It seems to me that it's increasingly narrow. And how can higher education? I mean, we could set our own standards. We know that doesn't work. It's what the people, it's what the students, it's what the faculty use in their daily life that they've become accustomed to. And for the most part, this is just secondary. It's a service that they accept, that they can change their password on the fly. I mean, that's not uncommon. I've seen people just, they don't, if it's a resource that they don't use frequently, they don't try to remember the password. They just go in and change it every time they go on. Jim Fout, how do you address that narrowing perception between the workforce IAM and the consumer one?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, right? Interestingly enough, you mentioned a good point, which is, if you have a service out there that you don't access very often, why set a password you're going to remember? It's probably not going to be a good password anyways, right? You want to probably put in a machine-generated password that nobody's going to hack or phish your account out of, and make it something that's not easy to remember. But really, if you take a look at, from a university perspective, students really are managed quite a bit like workforce identities, since the university controls their identity and the applications that they have access to. But in a lot of other ways, students are more like consumers or customers, since they really have choice to attend the university, pay the required fees, and so forth to access the services and the education. So really a good solution should be able to accommodate both of those aspects of the IAM spectrum equally. And so when it comes down to the identity management and user lifecycle management phases of the identity, you can set access policies, multi-factor authentication policies, and set up your directory integrations to sort of satisfy that workforce component. And then have other functions available, such as extensively being able to brand the user experience with your institution's branding, have things like OIDC support, which is OpenID Connect for building modern applications and mobile apps, and then also have capabilities to build in things like social authentication to address more of the consumer side. So as you start working with potentially alumni, adjunct professors, people that come in that are just sort of peripheral to the university, having social authentications or flexibility in terms of who they're going to bring in as part of their identity is really key. So being able to have a solution that's flexible and satisfy all those use cases is really important.
And I want to thank all the folks that have attempted to send in questions. Apparently we've answered them as they've come in. And so we'll just continue on since we have the experts here. And we've pretty much answered the questions that have come in. Jim, how when someone implements the product, how does one not lose the branding of the institution? I mean, the last thing you want to see is a product that is from an outside vendor and it displays the vendor's name on. How do you, because branding is so important anymore.
Right. There's anytime you put a solution out there, there's a lot of aspects of the brand. So really, when you take a look at all the different touch points that a person has with the digital assets, you want to make sure there's a consistent and seamless user experience, and quite often, honestly, that helps in preventing phishing attacks as well. So really putting the university brand on many different aspects of the end user interface should include things like the login screen, of course, user self-service when they go to change their password or unlock their account or do other things. Email messages, also important, right? SMS text alerts, and of course the URL that they have in the browser.
And I'll add one more. I want to add one more thing about, you said something I thought was very important, is that when we talk about the continuum, I like that you mentioned about alumni, because alumni are also people who eventually will hopefully give money back to the university as donors. And I think what Jim is saying also, by branding that your AMI so that they feel still part of the community, the campus community after they leave, or the campus, or they're alums of the campus. To me, that's an important part we kind of sometimes forget about, that branding should make them feel that they're always part of the family. So I think that's important to remember.
Oh, I totally agree. And I just want to say one thing in closing, in looking at the Okta product in particular, one of the most useful things is that Okta has a test environment in which users can go in and take a look at how they operate. And this is a real eye-opening experience to see how this third-party vendor lets you get under the hood and tinker with things. Being respectful of the time of our 1-hour commitment, we'll have to wrap it up here. And in closing, I would just like to thank everyone for joining us for today's event. I think this is such a critical topic. A big thank you needs to go to my fellow speakers, Jim Jorstad, Jim Fout, and a special thanks to our partners at Okta for enabling us to bring this worthwhile discussion to our audience. Thanks once again, and we look forward to seeing you at another Center for Digital Education event in the future.